In the heart of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, lies the quiet Amish village of Millbrook, where tradition runs deeper than the roots of century-old oak trees. Here, 45-year-old Ezra Stoltzfus has spent his entire life following the ways of his forefathers, until the day he makes a decision that will either destroy his reputation forever or reveal a truth that could save his entire community. When a mysterious bull tagged at just 25 cents appears at the local livestock auction, everyone sees a fool's bargain. But Ezra sees something else entirely, something that will test his faith, challenge his community, and ultimately lead to the most heart-wrenching discovery of his life. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty grounds of Miller's livestock auction as Ezra Stoltzfus adjusted his black felt hat and surveyed the crowded pens. At 45, his weathered hands told the story of a lifetime spent working the land, each callus a testament to his unwavering dedication to the Amish way of life. His beard, now more salt than pepper, rustled slightly in the October breeze as he moved methodically through the rows of cattle. Ezra called out his neighbor Samuel Byler, waving from across the yard. "What brings you to the auction today? Thought you had enough mouths to feed on your farm." Ezra's pale blue eyes crinkled at the corners as he approached his longtime friend. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, Samuel. Sometimes he calls us to places we don't expect." Samuel chuckled, his round belly shaking beneath his navy blue work shirt. "Well, I hope he's also calling you to bid wisely. Times have been hard enough without throwing good money after bad cattle." It was true, the past 2 seasons had been brutal for the Amish community of Millbrook. A late frost had destroyed much of the spring planting, followed by a summer drought that left even the hardiest crops withered and brown. Many families were struggling to make ends meet, and livestock auctions had become less about expanding herds and more about desperate farmers selling off their animals just to pay basic bills. Ezra nodded solemnly. "Aye, but faith isn't about the easy times, Samuel. It's about trusting when the path ahead is unclear." As they walked deeper into the auction grounds, the familiar sounds of lowing cattle and shouting auctioneers filled the air. Buyers clustered around the better animals, sleek Holstein dairy cows, sturdy Angus beef cattle, and prize breeding bulls that commanded top dollar. But it was in the far corner of the yard, almost hidden behind a rusted trailer, that Ezra's attention was drawn to something unusual. There, in a small pen that looked more like an afterthought than a proper enclosure, stood a bull unlike any Ezra had ever seen. The animal was massive, easily 2,000 pounds, with a coat so dark it seemed to absorb the sunlight. But it wasn't the bull's size or color that caught Ezra's eye. It was the way the creature stood, perfectly still, its head held high with an almost regal bearing. While other animals paced nervously or bellowed at the crowd, this bull remained calm, its dark eyes seeming to take in everything around it with quiet intelligence. "Would you look at that sorry sight?" laughed Jonas Yoder, one of the younger farmers, as he noticed Ezra's gaze. "Poor beast, looks half dead. Probably why they stuck it way back here." Ezra frowned, studying the animal more closely. The bull's ribs were indeed visible beneath its hide, and its coat lacked the healthy shine of a well-fed animal. But there was something in its stance, something in the way it carried itself, that spoke of strength rather than weakness. "What's the tag say?" asked Samuel, squinting at the small yellow marker attached to the bull's ear. Jonas moved closer to read it, then burst into laughter. 25 cents. Can you believe it? They're practically giving this walking beef jerky away." Soon, a small crowd had gathered around the pen, and word of the 25-cent bull spread through the auction like wildfire. Farmers pointed and laughed, making jokes about using the animal for dog food or selling it to the rendering plant. Even the auction hands seemed embarrassed by the creature's presence, going about their duties while pointedly avoiding eye contact with potential buyers. "Ezra, surely you're not seriously considering," Samuel began, noticing his friend's continued interest in the bull. But Ezra wasn't listening to the mockery around him. He was watching the bull's eyes, and in them he saw something that others had missed. Pain, Yes, but also a fierce intelligence and an unbroken spirit. This wasn't a dying animal, this was a survivor. Sometimes Ezra said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else, the things that appear worthless to the world hold the greatest value in God's eyes. The morning wore on, and lots were called and sold with the rhythmic chant of the auctioneer's voice. Prime cattle went for hundreds, sometimes thousands of dollars. Breeding stock commanded premium prices from buyers who traveled from distant states. But as the day progressed toward the less desirable animals, the crowd began to thin. Finally, as the sun reached its peak, the auctioneer's voice boomed across the yard. Lot 24-7, folks. One bull, approximately 6 years old, reserve price 25 cents. Do I hear 25 cents? The laughter that erupted from the remaining crowd was both cruel and dismissive. Even the auctioneer seemed to struggle to maintain his professional demeanor as he repeated the bid request. Come on now, folks. Somebody's got to need hamburger meat. 25 cents, that's less than a candy bar. Ezra felt the eyes of his community upon him as he raised his hand slightly. 25 cents, he called out, his voice steady and clear. The laughter died abruptly, replaced by stunned silence. Samuel gripped his friend's arm. Ezra, what are you doing? 25 cents. I have 25 cents. The auctioneer called out, clearly as surprised as everyone else. Do I hear 50 cents? 30 cents? Anyone? The silence stretched on, heavy with judgment and disbelief. Finally, the auctioneer's gavel came down. Sold to the gentleman in the black hat for 25 cents. As Ezra made his way to the payment booth, the whispers followed him like a shadow. Lost his mind, poor fellow. 45 years old and throwing away money on a dying bull. His wife Rebecca's going to have his hide. But the cruelest comment came from Jonas Yoder, loud enough for everyone to hear. Well, folks, looks like we know who the biggest fool in Millbrook is today. The laughter that followed cut deep, but Ezra's resolve didn't waver. He paid his 25 cents, arranged for transportation, and prepared to face what he knew would be an even harder audience at home. His own family. As the truck carrying his unlikely purchase disappeared down the dusty road toward his farm, Ezra couldn't shake the feeling that this moment would change everything. He just had no idea how right he would be, or how much pain and joy that change would bring. The bull's dark eyes had held secrets, and Ezra Stoltzfus, despite the mockery of his entire community, was determined to discover what they were. Little did he know that this 25-cent decision would soon shake the very foundations of Millbrook, testing faith, revealing truths, and ultimately leading to the most heart-wrenching discovery of his life. But first, he had to get home and explain to his wife Rebecca why he'd just spent their last quarter on what everyone else considered a worthless bull. The old Ford pickup truck rumbled to a stop in front of Ezra's weathered red barn, its engine coughing twice before falling silent. Through the kitchen window of the white farmhouse, Rebecca Stoltzfus watched her husband of 23 years climb down from the passenger seat, his movements slower than usual. At 42, she still possessed the quiet beauty that had captured Ezra's heart all those years ago, though worry lines now creased her forehead more often than laugh lines crinkled her eyes. "That's back," called out their youngest, 12-year-old Mary, her blonde braids bouncing as she ran from the house. Behind her followed their other children, 16-year-old Jacob, serious and responsible like his father, and 14-year-old Sarah, whose curious nature often got her into trouble. Rebecca dried her hands on her apron and stepped onto the porch, expecting to see Ezra walking toward the house, with his usual steady gait. Instead, she watched in growing confusion as he directed the truck driver toward the back pasture, gesturing animatedly at something in the truck's trailer. "What in heaven's name?" she muttered under her breath. The sound that emerged from the trailer as the ramp was lowered made Rebecca's heart skip a beat. It was deep, resonant, and unmistakably the bellow of a very large bull. The children froze mid-step, their eyes wide as saucers. Ezra Stoltzfus, Rebecca called out, her voice carrying the tone that 23 years of marriage had taught her husband to recognize. "What have you done?" But before Ezra could answer, the bull emerged from the trailer, and even Rebecca, despite her growing anger, found herself momentarily speechless. The animal was enormous, its massive frame casting a shadow across the farmyard. Despite its obvious malnourishment, there was something majestic about the way it held its head, something that commanded respect rather than pity. The truck driver, a grizzled old man named Pete, who'd been hauling livestock for 30 years, shook his head as he watched the bull slowly make its way into the pasture. "Mister, I've seen a lot of crazy purchases in my time, but this one takes the cake. You sure you know what you're doing?" Ezra pressed a few bills into Pete's weathered palm. "Sometimes, Pete, the Lord calls us to acts of faith that others might not understand." Pete shrugged, climbed back into his truck, and drove away, leaving the Stoltzfus family alone with their newest and most controversial addition. 25 cents, Ezra announced to his stunned family, attempting a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "That's all he cost." 25 cents? Jacob stepped closer to the fence, his young face a mixture of awe and confusion. "But Dad, he's huge. Why would anyone sell a bull that size for 25 cents? "Because," said a familiar voice from behind them, "your father has finally lost his mind completely." The family turned to see Samuel Byler approaching, his face flushed from the quick walk from his adjacent farm. Behind him trailed his wife Martha and their 3 teenage sons, all wearing expressions of barely concealed disbelief. "Samuel," Rebecca said evenly, though her voice carried a warning edge. "I'm sure Ezra had good reasons for his purchase." "Good reason?" Samuel's voice cracked with incredulity. "Rebecca, that animal is half dead. The entire auction was laughing at it and at your husband for buying it." The words hit Rebecca like physical blows. In their close-knit Amish community, reputation and respect were everything. To be mocked publicly was a shame that could follow a family for generations. "Is this true, Ezra?" she asked quietly, her earlier anger now replaced by hurt and embarrassment. Ezra looked at his wife, at his children, at his neighbors, and felt the weight of their judgment pressing down on him like a physical force. But when he turned his gaze to the bull, now standing quietly in the far corner of the pasture, something inside him remained unshakable. "The laughter of men means nothing if you're following God's will," he said simply. Samuel threw his hands up in exasperation. "God's will? Ezra, you spent your last money on a dying animal while your own family is struggling to make ends meet. How is that God's will?" "We don't know if he's dying," Mary piped up suddenly, causing all the adults to look down at her. "Maybe he's just hungry." "Out of the mouths of babes," Ezra murmured, reaching down to pat his youngest daughter's head. "Maybe indeed, little one." But Samuel wasn't finished. "Ezra, listen to reason. That bull cost you 25 cents because he's worthless. The kindest thing you could do is put him out of his misery and salvage what meat you can for your family." "No," the word burst from Ezra with surprising force, startling everyone present. "I won't hear another word about destroying this animal. He stays, he gets fed, and he gets the chance to show us what he's truly made of." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the bull seemed to sense the tension, raising his massive head to look directly at the group of humans discussing his fate. "And how exactly do you plan to feed him?" Martha Byler asked, her voice dripping with practical skepticism. "You've barely got enough hay to get your dairy cows through the winter as it is." It was true, and everyone knew it. The drought had decimated hay production across the region, and what little was available commanded premium prices that most farmers couldn't afford. Feed stores were rationing supplies, and more than one family had already been forced to sell off flocks they couldn't afford to maintain. "We'll manage," Rebecca said, suddenly surprising everyone, including herself. Despite her anger and embarrassment, she couldn't bear to see her husband humiliated further in front of their neighbors. Samuel shook his head in disgust. "You're both fools. Mark my words. Ezra Stoltzfus, this decision will be the ruin of your family." And don't come crying to me when reality sets in." As the Byler family stalked away, their disapproval hanging in the air like a storm cloud, the Stoltzfus family was left alone with their controversial new addition. "Dude," Sarah said quietly, "what are we going to call him?" Ezra considered the question, watching as the bull moved slowly around the perimeter of the pasture, taking inventory of his new surroundings. Despite his obvious malnutrition, there was purpose in his movements, intelligence in the way he tested the fence posts and examined the water trough. "Goliath," Ezra said finally. "His name is Goliath." Jacob frowned. "But Dad, didn't David defeat Goliath in the Bible? Isn't that a bad name for our bull?" Ezra's weathered face broke into the first genuine smile he'd worn all day. "Sometimes, son, the giants in our lives aren't meant to be defeated. Sometimes they're meant to teach us about courage, about faith, and about looking past appearances to see the truth underneath." As if he'd understood every word, Goliath raised his massive head and looked directly at Ezra. For a moment, man and beast regarded each other across the pasture, and Ezra felt a connection he couldn't quite explain, a sense that this animal's arrival in his life was far from coincidence. That evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table for their modest meal of soup and bread, the conversation kept returning to their unexpected guest. Through the window they could see Goliath silhouetted against the darkening sky, still as a statue, still watching. "He hasn't touched the hay we put out," Rebecca observed, her practical nature asserting itself. "Maybe he's too sick to eat. Or maybe," suggested Mary, "he's just scared. If everyone's been mean to him, he probably doesn't trust people anymore." "Animals can sense kindness," Jacob added thoughtfully. "Maybe he just needs time to understand we're different." But it was Sarah who voiced what they were all thinking. "What if the neighbors are right, Dad? What if he really is dying? What if we can't save him?" Ezra set down his spoon and looked around the table at his family's faces. Faces that had learned to trust his judgment over more than 2 decades, even when that judgment seemed questionable to others. "Then we'll have given him a peaceful place to spend his final days," Ezra said quietly. "And sometimes that's the greatest gift we can offer another living creature, dignity in their darkest hour." Outside, as if responding to some unheard signal, Goliath finally moved toward the hay pile and began to eat, his massive jaws working methodically in the moonlight. None of them could have imagined that this simple act, a starving bull finally accepting food, was the first step in a chain of events that would soon test everything they believed about faith, community, and the true meaning of miracles. But as Rebecca watched her husband's face in the lamplight, she saw something there she hadn't seen in months. Hope. And despite her fears, despite the mockery of their neighbors, despite the uncertainty of their future, she found herself praying that Ezra's inexplicable faith in this broken-down bull might somehow be justified. Little did she know that Goliath carried within him a secret that would soon change not just their family, but their entire community in ways none of them could possibly foresee. Word of Ezra's foolish purchase spread through Millbrook faster than wildfire in August wheat. By the next morning, it seemed every person in the community had heard about the 25-cent bull, and opinions were as abundant as they were harsh. At Yoda's general store, the unofficial center of local gossip, clusters of men gathered around the pot-bellied stove, shaking their heads and clucking their tongues like disapproving hens. "Always knew Ezra was a bit touched," muttered old Heinrich Müller, his arthritic fingers wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. "But this takes the cake. Man's got 3 children to feed, and he wastes money on dying livestock." "It's not the money that bothers me," added Benjamin King, the community's most prosperous farmer. 25 cents won't break anyone. It's the principle of the thing. Shows poor judgment. And in times like these, we can't afford leaders who make foolish decisions. The gathering murmured their agreement, but it was Jonas Yoda's voice that cut through the morning air with particular venom. "I was there, saw the whole thing," he announced dramatically, clearly relishing his role as primary witness. "That bull looked like death warmed over ribs, showing coat dull, could barely stand straight. Even the auctioneer was embarrassed to sell it. And Ezra just bid on it anyway? Asked Amos Fisher, leaning forward with morbid curiosity. Didn't even hesitate, Jonas exclaimed, raised his hand like he was bidding on prize breeding stock. You should have heard the laughter. Even the English farmers thought he'd lost his mind. The mention of ridicule from the outside community. The English, as the Amish called all non-Amish people, struck the gathered men like a physical blow. To be mocked by their own was embarrassing enough, but to become a laughingstock among outsiders threatened the dignity of their entire community. Meanwhile, 3 miles away, the women of Millbrook were conducting their own trial of Ezra Stoltzfus at the weekly quilting circle held in Martha Byler's spotless kitchen. Poor Rebecca, sighed Anna Lapp, her needle pausing mid-stitch. 23 years married to that man. And now this. How is she supposed to hold her head up in church? It's not just Rebecca I worry about, Martha Byler interjected, her voice tight with righteous indignation. It's those children, young Mary especially at 12 years old. She's old enough to understand when her father's being made a fool of, but too young to understand why. The circle of women nodded solemnly, their fingers working mechanically at the wedding quilt they were creating for Anna's eldest daughter. Someone needs to talk sense into him, declared Ruth Yoder, Jonas's wife. This has gone beyond eccentricity. The man's bringing shame on all of us. And what about the example he's setting? Added Elizabeth Fisher, her voice rising with passion. Our young men look up to Ezra. He's been a deacon in our church for 8 years. What are they supposed to think when they see him making such foolish choices? Back at the Stoltzfus farm, the subject of all this community concern was entirely focused on his controversial purchase. Ezra had risen before dawn, as was his custom, but instead of heading straight to milk his dairy cows, he'd made his way to the back pasture where Goliath stood silhouetted against the morning mist. The bull had eaten most of the hay during the night. A promising sign, but he still maintained his distance from humans, watching Ezra's approach with wary intelligence. "Good morning, old fellow," Ezra said quietly, his voice carrying the same gentle tone he used with all his animals. "Feeling a bit better after some food, I hope." Goliath's ears swiveled toward the sound, but he made no move to approach or retreat. His massive head remained high, his dark eyes never leaving Ezra's face. Ezra turned to see Jacob approaching through the morning mist, a steaming cup of coffee in his hands. "Ma'am thought you might need this," the boy said, offering the cup to his father. Ezra accepted it gratefully, wrapping his work-worn fingers around the warmth. "Thank you, son. You're up early." Jacob shrugged, but his eyes were troubled. "Couldn't sleep much. Keep thinking about what Herr Byler said yesterday." "And what's that got you worried?" The 16-year-old glanced toward Goliath, then back at his father. "He said people are talking, Dad, saying things about our family, about you. Is it true that everyone at the auction was laughing?" The pain in his son's voice cut Ezra deeper than any adult criticism could have. Jacob was at the age where peer acceptance mattered enormously, and having a father who was the subject of community ridicule couldn't be easy. "Some were laughing." "Yes," Ezra admitted. "People often laugh at things they don't understand. But what if they're right?" Jacob's voice cracked slightly, betraying his youth despite his attempts at maturity. "What if Goliath really is dying? What if we can't afford to feed him through the winter? What if—" "Jacob," Ezra's quiet voice stopped the flood of worried questions. "Come here." Father and son stood side by side at the fence, looking out at the massive bull who continued to regard them with patient dignity. "Tell me what you see when you look at him," Ezra said. Jacob studied the animal carefully. "He's thin, definitely undernourished. His coat's dull. He's obviously been neglected." He paused, then added reluctantly, "But he doesn't look sick, exactly. Just hungry." "What else? He's huge. Even underweight, he's got to be close to 2,000 pounds. Good bone structure, broad chest." Jacob's voice grew more confident as he applied the livestock evaluation skills his father had taught him. "And he's alert. His eyes are clear, and he's been watching everything, not like a sick animal would act." Ezra smiled. "Exactly. Now tell me, if you saw this bull in good condition, well-fed and healthy, what would you think he'd be worth? Jacob considered the question seriously. A bull that size, with good conformation, if he's got decent bloodlines, he could be worth thousands of dollars. So the question becomes, Ezra said quietly, why was he being sold for 25 cents? It was a question that had been haunting Ezra since the moment he'd first laid eyes on Goliath. Championship bulls didn't end up forgotten in back corners of livestock auctions unless something was very wrong or very unusual. Maybe his owner died, Jacob suggested, or went out of business. Maybe nobody knew his value. Maybe Ezra agreed. Or maybe there's something else entirely going on. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of buggy wheels on gravel. Looking toward the road, they saw Bishop Daniel Hershberger's familiar black buggy turning into their lane. Jacob's eyes widened. The bishop? This early? Ezra's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. A visit from the bishop at dawn was rarely social, and given the circumstances, Ezra could guess what had brought the community's spiritual leader to his door. Go tell your mother we have company, Ezra instructed his son. And Jacob? Not a word about our conversation to anyone. Not yet. As Jacob hurried toward the house, Ezra took a last look at Goliath, who seemed to sense the importance of the moment. The bull's massive head turned toward the approaching buggy, his ears pricked forward with interest rather than fear. Well, old friend, Ezra murmured, looks like we're both about to face judgment. Bishop Hershberger was a man whose very presence commanded respect. At 68, his long white beard and piercing blue eyes had witnessed the joys and sorrows of 3 generations of Millbrook families. He'd baptized Ezra, officiated at his wedding, and had been a steady source of spiritual guidance for over 2 decades, which was why the obvious disappointment in his expression as he climbed down from his buggy cut Ezra so deeply. "Good morning, Ezra," the bishop said, his voice carrying the formal tone reserved for serious matters. "Bishop Hershberger," Ezra replied with equal formality. "You're welcome in our home, as always." The 2 men walked toward the house in silence, but Ezra couldn't help but notice how the bishop's gaze lingered on Goliath, and how his frown deepened at the sight of the massive bull. Inside the house, Rebecca had quickly set out her best china and put coffee on to brew. The children gathered in the kitchen, sensing the gravity of the situation, but uncertain what was happening. "Rebecca, children," the bishop nodded to each in turn before taking the seat. Ezra offered at the head of the kitchen table. "I hope you'll forgive the early hour, but I felt this matter couldn't wait." "Of course, Bishop," Rebecca replied, though Ezra could hear the tension in her voice. Bishop Hershberger accepted a cup of coffee, then fixed Ezra with a steady gaze. "I suppose you know why I'm here." "I can guess," Ezra replied quietly. "Good, then you'll understand my concern when I tell you that 3 different families came to me yesterday evening, all worried about the same thing, your judgment, Ezra, your spiritual condition." The words hung in the air like an indictment. In Amish society, questions about one's spiritual condition were among the most serious charges that could be leveled. "With respect, Bishop," Ezra said carefully, "purchasing livestock isn't typically considered a spiritual matter. It is when that purchase brings ridicule upon our entire community," the bishop replied firmly. "It is when it demonstrates a lack of wisdom that calls into question your fitness for leadership. You're a deacon, Ezra. People look to you for guidance. What guidance does this decision offer?" Ezra felt his family's eyes upon him, felt the weight of their faith in him pressing against the equally heavy weight of community disapproval. "Sometimes," he said slowly, "the Lord calls us to act on faith rather than conventional wisdom. And sometimes," the bishop countered, "pride masquerades as faith, and stubbornness disguises itself as divine calling." The accusation struck home, and Ezra felt a moment of doubt creep into his heart. Was he being foolishly stubborn? Was his certainty about Goliath nothing more than pride refusing to admit a mistake? But then, through the kitchen window, he caught sight of the bull standing motionless in the morning sun, and something in that patient, dignified bearing reinforced his conviction. "Bishop," he said quietly. "I ask only for time. Give me 30 days to prove that this decision wasn't made in folly. And if you can't prove it," Ezra met the older man's eyes steadily, "then I'll accept whatever consequences the community deems appropriate." The bishop studied Ezra's face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. 30 days, Ezra. But understand, the eyes of our entire community are upon you now. Don't let pride lead you into bringing further shame upon your family. As the bishop's buggy disappeared down the lane, the Stoltzfus family was left in heavy silence. Finally, young Mary spoke up, her voice small but determined. "I believe in you, Dat, and I believe in Goliath." Looking down at his youngest daughter's trusting face, Ezra felt both the burden of responsibility and the spark of hope that would sustain him through the challenging days ahead. He had 30 days to prove that the community's biggest fool might actually be its greatest visionary. The countdown had begun. 13 days into Ezra's 30-day ultimatum, disaster struck Millbrook in a way no one could have predicted. It began with a phone call to the village's only telephone booth, located outside Yoder's general store. Patricia Winters, the local veterinarian who served both Amish and English farmers throughout Lancaster County, had grim news that would shake the community to its core. "I need to speak with all the cattle owners immediately," she told Heinrich Müller, who had answered the phone. "We have a serious problem." Within an hour, word had spread through the community like wildfire, and farmers began gathering at the Byler farm, where Samuel had agreed to host the emergency meeting. Winters, a woman in her 50s with prematurely grey hair and tired eyes, stood before the assembled group with a manila folder clutched in her weathered hands. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice heavy with the weight of bad news, "I've just received test results from the State Agricultural Laboratory. We have confirmed cases of bovine spongiform encephalopathy in 3 herds within a 50-mile radius of Millbrook." The silence that followed was deafening. BCE, commonly known as mad cow disease, was every cattle farmer's nightmare. Fatal to animals, potentially transmissible to humans, and economically devastating to entire regions. "What does this mean for us?" asked Benjamin King, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Winters opened her folder and consulted her notes. "State regulations require immediate testing of all cattle within the affected radius. Any animals that test positive must be destroyed immediately. Entire herds that show exposure must be quarantined indefinitely." "How long does testing take?" Samuel asked, though his face suggested he already feared the answer. "Blood samples go to the state lab. Results take 7 to 10 days. Dr. Winters paused, letting the implications sink in. "During that time, no cattle can be moved, sold, or processed. Milk from potentially affected herds cannot be sold." The economic implications were staggering. Most of the families in Millbrook depended on their dairy operations for basic income. 10 days without milk sales, followed by the potential loss of entire herds, would financially destroy half the community. "There's more," Dr. Winters continued reluctantly. "The state is requiring genetic testing as well as blood work. They want to trace bloodlines, identify common sources. Any bull used for breeding in the past 5 years needs to be tested immediately." Jonas Yoder raised his hand. "What about that bull Ezra Stoltzfus bought, the one from the auction?" Dr. Winters consulted her clipboard. "Any animal purchased in the last 30 days needs priority testing." "Where did he acquire it?" "Miller's livestock auction," Samuel replied, shooting a meaningful glance at several other men. "Paid 25 cents for it." "Miller's?" Dr. Winters frowned deeply. "That's one of the affected sites. 3 animals from last month's sale have already tested positive." The weight of this revelation settled over the group like a suffocating blanket. Ezra's foolish purchase hadn't just brought ridicule, it might have brought disease. "I'll need to test that bull first thing tomorrow morning," Dr. Winters announced. "Until we get results, the entire Stoltzfus farm is under quarantine." Meanwhile, at the Stoltzfus farm, Ezra was experiencing something that defied all logical explanation. It had started 3 days earlier when he'd noticed Goliath behaving strangely. The bull, who had gradually gained weight and strength over the past 10 days, had begun displaying an unusual agitation. He paced the perimeter of his pasture, stopping frequently to face the road, his massive head raised as if listening to something only he could hear. "What's gotten into him?" Rebecca asked, joining her husband at the kitchen window where he'd been watching the bull's odd behavior. "I'm not sure," Ezra admitted. "He's been like this since Tuesday, almost like he's trying to tell us something." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of a car coming up their lane, an unusual occurrence in their predominantly horse and buggy community. Looking out, they saw their neighbor, Tom Harrison, climbing out of his pickup truck with obvious urgency. Tom was one of the few English farmers in the area, a gruff but good-hearted man in his 60s who had always maintained friendly relations with his Amish neighbors, despite their different ways of life. "Ezra," Tom called out as he hurried toward the house. "Thank God you're here. I need your help. It's an emergency." "What's wrong, Tom?" "It's my prize bull, Thunder. He's been acting sick for 2 days, and this morning I found him down in the pasture. Can't get up, barely breathing. My vet's out of town, and Dr. Winters is tied up with some disease outbreak. I don't know what to do." Ezra's brow furrowed with concern. Thunder was Tom's pride and joy, a champion Black Angus worth more than most people's houses. "Have you tried?" "I've tried everything I know," Tom interrupted desperately. "Ezra, I've seen you work with sick animals before. You've got a gift. Would you come take a look, please?" Rebecca touched her husband's arm. "Go," she said quietly. "Help our neighbor." 20 minutes later, Ezra stood in Tom Harrison's pasture, looking down at Thunder with growing alarm. The massive bull lay on his side, his breathing shallow and labored. His eyes were glazed with fever, and despite the cool October air, sweat matted his coat. "How long has he been down?" Ezra asked, kneeling beside the animal. "Found him like this at dawn. He was fine yesterday evening when I fed him." Tom's voice cracked with emotion. "Ezra, this bull represents my entire retirement fund. If I lose him..." Ezra examined the animal carefully, his experienced hands checking for obvious injuries or signs of common ailments. But Thunder's symptoms didn't match any standard cattle illness he'd encountered. "Tom, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Has Thunder been around any new animals recently? Any contact with cattle from outside your farm?" Tom shook his head. "No, he's been in his own pasture for months." "Why? These symptoms, they're not typical. It's almost like he's been poisoned, but not by anything I recognize." As if responding to some internal alarm, Ezra suddenly stood up straight. "Tom, I need to get back to my farm immediately. Keep Thunder as comfortable as possible. Give him fresh water if he'll take it, but don't try to force him to stand." "Where are you going?" "To get Goliath." Tom's expression shifted from desperation to confusion. "Your bull?" "Ezra, what does..." "Trust me, Tom. Something's happening here that I don't fully understand, but I think Goliath might be the key." The drive back to his farm took only 5 minutes, but to Ezra it felt like hours. As soon as his buggy turned into the lane, he could see Goliath pacing frantically along the fence line closest to the road, his agitation more pronounced than ever. "Jacob," Ezra called out as he jumped down from the buggy. "Help me get Goliath loaded into Tom's trailer." "What date?" "Why? No time for questions, son. Just help me." It took both of them plus Tom, who had followed in his truck, to coax Goliath into the livestock trailer. But surprisingly, once the bull understood what they wanted, he seemed almost eager to comply, as if he'd been waiting for this moment. Back at the Harrison farm, what happened next would be talked about in Millbrook for generations. As soon as Goliath was unloaded, he walked directly to where Thunder lay dying. Without hesitation, the massive bull lowered his head and began what could only be described as nuzzling the sick animal, making soft, almost purring sounds that none of the men had ever heard a bull make. "What in the hell?" Tom whispered, too amazed to apologize for his language. Goliath's behavior continued for nearly an hour. He circled Thunder repeatedly, occasionally stopping to make physical contact, touching noses, resting his massive head against Thunder's flank, all while maintaining that strange, gentle vocalization. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, Goliath stepped back and stood perfectly still, his dark eyes fixed on Thunder with an intensity that was almost hypnotic. "Ezra," Tom said quietly, "I don't know what your bull is doing, but Thunder's breathing is getting stronger." It was true. The labored gasping that had characterized Thunder's condition was gradually giving way to deeper, more regular respiration. His glazed eyes began to clear, and for the first time in hours, he lifted his massive head. Over the next 2 hours, they watched in stunned silence as Thunder slowly, impossibly, recovered. First he lifted his head, then shifted to lying upright, then finally, to Tom's tearful amazement, struggled to his feet. "I don't believe it," Tom kept repeating. "I just don't believe it." But Ezra did believe it, because he'd seen something in Goliath's behavior that the others had missed. Throughout the entire healing process, the bull's attention had never been entirely focused on Thunder. His ears had swiveled constantly, as if listening to distant sounds, and his nostrils had flared repeatedly, testing the air for scents only he could detect. Goliath wasn't just healing Thunder, he was diagnosing the entire area. As they loaded the exhausted but satisfied Goliath back into the trailer, Tom gripped Ezra's arm with tears in his eyes. "I don't know how to thank you," he said. "That bull of yours. There's something special about him, isn't there?" "Yes," Ezra replied quietly, watching Goliath settle into the trailer with calm dignity. "I believe there is." But even as Tom's grateful words warmed his heart, Ezra couldn't shake a growing sense of urgency. Goliath's agitation hadn't ended with Thunder's healing. If anything, it had tanted. The bull's head remained raised, his nostrils flaring, his entire body tense with alert attention. Something was still wrong in Millbrook, and Goliath knew it. As they drove home in the gathering dusk, Ezra found himself wondering if the strange healing he'd just witnessed was connected to the mysterious circumstances surrounding Goliath's auction. A champion bull sold for 25 cents, a healing ability that seemed almost supernatural, and now reports of disease spreading through the region's cattle population. Tomorrow, Winters would arrive to test Goliath for BSE, and the results would determine not just the bull's fate, but possibly the future of the entire Stoltzfus family. But tonight, as Ezra watched Goliath stand motionless in his pasture, still alert, still listening to sounds only he could hear, one thing had become crystal clear. This was no ordinary bull, and whatever was happening in Millbrook was far from over. Winters arrived at the Stoltzfus farm at precisely 8 a.m., her white veterinary truck kicking up dust clouds in the crisp, morning air. Behind her followed 3 state agricultural inspectors in an official government vehicle, their presence adding an ominous weight to what everyone hoped would be a routine testing procedure. Ezra, Rebecca, and their 3 children stood near the barn, watching the convoy approach with growing anxiety. Word of the emergency BSE testing had spread through Millbrook overnight, and small clusters of neighbors had gathered along the road, maintaining a respectful distance, but clearly eager to witness the outcome. "Remember," Rebecca whispered to her husband as Doc Winters climbed out of her truck, "whatever happens, we face it together." Dr. Winters approached with her usual professional demeanor, but Ezra could see the strain in her eyes. The past 24 hours had clearly taken their toll on the veterinarian as she dealt with the crisis spreading throughout the region. "Good morning, Ezra," she said, pulling on latex gloves. "I wish we were meeting under better circumstances." "As do I," Ezra replied. "What exactly does the testing involve?" "Blood samples, primarily. We'll also need tissue samples for genetic analysis." She paused, consulting her clipboard. "I have to tell you, the situation has gotten worse overnight. 2 more farms tested positive, and we've had to destroy over 40 animals." The weight of this revelation settled heavily on the assembled family. 40 animals represented not just economic loss, but the destruction of bloodlines that some families had been carefully developing for generations. Dr. Winters, Jacob spoke up hesitantly. What happens if Goliath tests positive? The veterinarian's expression softened as she looked at the young man. If he tests positive for active BSE, he'll have to be destroyed immediately. If he shows exposure but not active disease, the entire herd goes into extended quarantine. Mary gasped audibly at the word destroyed, and Rebecca pulled her youngest daughter closer. However, Dr. Winters continued, there is one piece of potentially good news. We've identified the source of the outbreak, a contaminated feed supplement that was distributed to several farms in the region about 6 months ago. If your bull wasn't fed that particular supplement, his chances of testing negative are significantly higher. What was the name of the supplement? Ezra asked. Dr. Winters consulted her notes. Protogain Cattle Enhancer. It was manufactured by a company that's since been shut down by the FDA. Ezra felt a wave of relief wash over him. We've never used any commercial supplements on our farm. All our cattle are fed hay, grain, and pasture grass. Nothing else. That's encouraging, Dr. Winters nodded. Let's get the testing done and hope for the best. The process of drawing blood from Goliath proved surprisingly easy. Despite his massive size and the presence of strangers, the bull stood perfectly still, almost as if he understood the importance of cooperation. Dr. Winters commented on his unusual docility as she labeled the samples. I have to say, Ezra, this is one of the calmest bulls I've ever worked with. Usually animals his size require sedation for procedures like this. He's been like that since we got him, Sarah observed. Almost like he knows we're trying to help him. As Dr. Winters packed her samples for transport to the state laboratory, one of the agricultural inspectors, a thin man in his 40s named Robert Chen, approached Ezra with a puzzled expression. Mr. Stoltzfus, I need to ask you some questions about this animal's history. According to our records, you purchased him at Miller's livestock auction 13 days ago for 25 cents. Is that correct? Yes, sir, it is. Can you tell me why such a valuable-looking animal was being sold for virtually nothing? Ezra had been dreading this question, primarily because he had no good answer. I honestly don't know. The bull was penned separately from the main livestock, and nobody seemed to know anything about his background. Inspector Chen made notes on his tablet. We've been investigating Miller's auction as part of this outbreak. 3 animals sold there last month have tested positive for BSE. He looked up at Ezra with sharp eyes. What made you decide to purchase this particular bull? It was a question Ezra had asked himself countless times over the past 2 weeks, and the only honest answer still sounded foolish even to his own ears. Something about him seemed special, Ezra said quietly. He had the bearing of a champion, despite his condition. Inspector Chen's eyebrows raised slightly. Special how? Before Ezra could answer, they were interrupted by the sound of rapid hoofbeats on the gravel road. Tom Harrison's pickup truck was racing up the lane, dust flying behind it as he took the turn too fast and skidded to a stop near the group. Tom leaped out of the truck with unusual agility for a man his age, his face flushed with excitement and something else, something that looked almost like fear. Ezra, he called out breathlessly, you need to come with me right now. Something's happening with the other bulls in the area, and I think it's connected to what happened yesterday. Dr. Winters stepped forward. Tom, what are you talking about? What other bull? That's just it. There aren't any other bulls left, Tom said, his words tumbling over each other in his haste. In the past 12 hours, every breeding bull within 10 miles of here has either died or gone completely insane. Except Thunder. He's the only one that's normal, and he's the only one that had contact with Goliath. The silence that followed Tom's announcement was profound. Dr. Winters exchanged glances with Inspector Chen, both clearly struggling to process this information. Tom, Winters said carefully, are you saying that multiple bulls have died overnight? Not just died, something worse. The Peterson farm lost their prize Hereford this morning, found him lying in the field like he'd just dropped dead. The Miller brothers' Holstein bull went crazy around midnight, had to be put down before he hurt someone. and the Kendricks, Angus, started attacking his own herd. Inspector Chen was typing rapidly on his tablet. "Mr. Harrison, these incidents need to be reported immediately. We'll need tissue samples from all deceased animals." "There's more," Tom continued, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "I talked to the other farmers this morning. Every single one of them had fed their bulls that Protogain supplement Dr. Winters mentioned. Everyone except me. I've always been too cheap to buy commercial feed additives." The implications of Tom's statement hit the group like a physical blow. If the contaminated supplement had affected all the bulls in the area, and if those animals were now dying or becoming dangerous, then the breeding stock for the entire region was being wiped out. "But that still doesn't explain what happened yesterday," Tom continued, his eyes fixed on Goliath. "When your bull did whatever he did to Thunder, it wasn't just healing. It was like he was drawing the poison out of him." Dr. Winters shook her head. "Tom, that's not medically possible. BSE doesn't work that way." "Then explain this," Tom interrupted, pulling a folded paper from his shirt pocket. "I had Thunder's blood tested yesterday evening at the emergency clinic in Lancaster. These are the results." Dr. Winters unfolded the paper and scanned it quickly, her expression growing more confused with each line. Finally, she looked up at Tom with genuine bewilderment. "This can't be right," she said. "According to these results, Thunder's blood shows traces of BSE proteins, but they're completely inactive. It's like the disease was neutralized somehow." Inspector Chen leaned over to read the results. "Dr. Winters, in your professional opinion, is this possible?" "Frankly, it's not possible. BSE doesn't just neutralize itself, and there's no known treatment or cure." She looked at Goliath with new interest. Unless what?" Ezra asked. "There are some animals that show natural immunity to certain diseases. It's rare, but not unheard of. If this bull carries some kind of genetic immunity to BSE, and if that immunity could somehow be transferred." She trailed off, shaking her head. "But even then, what Tom is describing sounds more like active healing than passive immunity." Young Mary, who had been listening intently to the adult conversation, suddenly spoke up. "Maybe Goliath is like the goats." All eyes turned to the 12-year-old girl. "What goats, sweetheart?" Rebecca asked. "The ones in my science book at school. It said that some goats in Africa can eat poisonous plants that would kill other animals, and they don't get sick. Maybe Goliath can do something like that with the cow sickness." Winters stared at Mary for a long moment, then suddenly began rifling through her veterinary bag with urgent purpose. That's not as far-fetched as it sounds," she muttered, pulling out additional testing equipment. "There are documented cases of animals with unusual enzyme productions that allow them to neutralize toxins. If this bull has some kind of unique biological mechanism—" "Dr. Winters," Inspector Chen interrupted. "What are you suggesting?" The veterinarian straightened up, her expression intense with scientific curiosity. "I'm suggesting that we need to run additional tests immediately, not just for BSE but for genetic markers, enzyme levels, antibody production, everything we can think of." "And if the tests show what you think they might show?" Ezra asked. Dr. Winters looked at Goliath, who had been standing calmly throughout the entire discussion, as if patiently waiting for the humans to understand what he already knew. "If the tests confirm what I'm starting to suspect," she said slowly, "then this bull isn't just immune to BSE. He might be able to cure it in other animals. And if that's true, then he's not just valuable, he's irreplaceable." The weight of this possibility settled over the group like a revelation. Could the bull that everyone had mocked as worthless actually hold the key to saving the region's entire cattle industry? As Dr. Winters began drawing additional blood samples with renewed urgency, Ezra found himself thinking about the strange circumstances that had brought Goliath into his life. A champion bull sold for 25 cents, displaying healing abilities that seemed to defy medical explanation, arriving just in time to potentially save the community that had ridiculed his purchase. It was almost as if Dr. Winters, Ezra said suddenly, I need to ask you something. Is it possible that someone knew about Goliath's abilities, that he was sold for 25 cents, not because he was worthless, but because someone wanted to hide his true value? The veterinarian paused in her work, considering the question. You mean, was this intention? Someone deliberately placing a genetically valuable animal where he could be acquired cheaply? Exactly. Inspector Chen looked up from his tablet. Mr. Stoltzfus, that's a very interesting theory, and if it's true, it raises some serious questions about who might have that kind of knowledge, and why they would want this bull to end up specifically with you. As the morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the farmyard, the Stoltzfus family found themselves at the center of a mystery that was growing more complex by the hour. But one thing was becoming increasingly clear: the bull they had rescued from ridicule might very well end up rescuing them all. The laboratory results arrived 3 days later, delivered personally by Dr. Winters in the company of 2 officials from the USDA and a geneticist from Penn State University. The convoy of vehicles turning into the Stoltzfus lane drew neighbors from across Millbrook, creating an impromptu gathering that would witness one of the most extraordinary revelations in the community's history. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the geneticist, was a woman in her 30s with intense brown eyes and an air of barely contained excitement. She carried a thick folder of test results and what appeared to be several enlarged photographs. Mr. Stoltzfus, Dr. Winters began as the group assembled near the barn. What we've discovered about your bull is unprecedented in veterinary science. Ezra felt Rebecca's hand slip into his, her grip tight with anxiety. Around them their children stood close, while neighbors maintained a respectful distance, straining to hear every word. First, Dr. Martinez spoke up, her voice carrying the enthusiasm of a scientist making a groundbreaking discovery. Your bull has tested completely negative for BS, not just current infection, but any exposure whatsoever. A collective sigh of relief rippled through the gathered community members, but Dr. Martinez raised her hand to indicate she wasn't finished. However, that's actually the least remarkable thing about him. What we've found in his genetic profile is absolutely extraordinary. She opened her folder and pulled out what looked like a scientific pedigree chart. Mr. Stoltzfus, do you have any idea what kind of bull you actually purchased? I assumed he was just a mixed breed, Ezra admitted. Nobody at the auction seemed to know his background. Dr. Martinez smiled. He's not mixed breed at all. He's a purebred Wagyu, specifically, a direct descendant of the legendary Kitateriasu Doi line from Japan. Bulls of this bloodline are worth between $250,000. The silence that followed was so complete that the only sound was the wind rustling through the autumn leaves. Even the neighbors who had been maintaining their distance unconsciously moved closer, certain they had misheard. I'm sorry, Samuel Byler said, his voice barely above a whisper. Did you say $500,000? At minimum, Dr. Martinez confirmed. But that's still not the most remarkable thing about him. She pulled out another set of documents, these covered with complex molecular diagrams. Your bull carries a genetic mutation that we've never seen before in cattle. His liver produces an enzyme, we're calling it BSE neutralase, that can literally break down the prion proteins that cause BSE and render them harmless. Dr. Winters took over the explanation. What happened when Goliath had contact with thunder wasn't faith healing or magic. It was biochemistry. Goliath's saliva, breath, and even his skin secretions contain this enzyme. When he had extended contact with thunder, he was literally neutralizing the BSE proteins in Thunder's system. But that's impossible, protested Heinrich Müller, who had pushed forward through the crowd. Animals can't cure diseases just by touching. Under normal circumstances, you'd be absolutely right, Dr. Martinez agreed. But Goliath isn't normal. We believe his unique enzyme production is the result of a spontaneous genetic mutation, essentially evolution creating a natural defense against BSE. Tom Harrison, who had been standing quietly at the edge of the group, suddenly spoke up. That explains why Thunder recovered. But what about the timing? Why did all the other bulls in the area start dying right when Goliath arrived? It was one of the USDA officials, a serious man named Dr. Frank Kowalski, who answered, "Mr. Harrison, we believe the timing was intentional. We've been investigating the source of your bull's arrival at Miller's auction, and what we've found suggests this was a carefully orchestrated operation." He pulled out a different folder, this one containing what appeared to be official documents and photographs. 3 months ago, a genetics research facility in California reported the theft of several experimental animals, including one bull with unique genetic characteristics. The theft was covered up to avoid publicity, but we now believe Goliath was that stolen bull. "Stolen?" Rebecca gasped. "You mean he's not ours to keep?" "That's where the story gets even more interesting," Dr. Kowalski continued. "The research facility was conducting illegal experiments, genetic manipulation without FDA approval. When their work was exposed, the company was shut down and its assets seized. Legally, Goliath belongs to whoever purchased him at legitimate auction." Inspector Chen, who had been consulting his tablet, looked up with a puzzled expression, but that still doesn't explain how he ended up being sold for 25 cents, or why someone would want to hide such a valuable animal. Dr. Martinez smiled sadly. "We believe we know the answer to that as well." The lead researcher on the project was Dr. Amanda Fisher. She died in a car accident 2 weeks before the facility was shut down. But before her death, she had expressed serious concerns about her company's intentions for the animals. She pulled out a final document, what appeared to be a handwritten letter. This was found among Dr. Fisher's personal effects. It's addressed to whoever finds this letter and explains her fears that the company planned to sell Goliath's genetic material to the highest bidder, regardless of the consequences for animal welfare or food safety. Dr. Winters took over the explanation. Fisher believed that Goliath's abilities should be used to help farming communities, not to make profits for corporations. According to this letter, she arranged for his escape and transportation to Miller's auction, specifically requesting that he be sold cheaply to ensure he would end up with a family farmer rather than a commercial operation. "But why Miller's auction?" Ezra asked. "Why here?" "Because," Martinez said softly, "Dr. Fisher had researched farming communities throughout Pennsylvania, and she specifically chose Millbrook. According to her notes, she wanted Goliath to go to someone who would treat him with kindness regardless of his monetary value, someone who would see past his poor condition to his true worth." The implications of this revelation washed over Ezra like a tidal wave. Fisher hadn't just randomly chosen their community. She had specifically selected it, and by extension had somehow known that Ezra would be the one to recognize Goliath's value. "There's more," Dr. Kowalski added. "Fisher's letter explains that she chose the 25-cent price specifically. She wanted to ensure that only someone motivated by compassion rather than profit would purchase him. Anyone looking for a bargain would have assumed he was worthless and avoided him entirely." Young Jacob, who had been listening intently, suddenly spoke up. "So Dr. Fisher was testing people, seeing who would be kind to an animal that appeared to be dying." "Exactly," Dr. Martinez confirmed. "And your father passed that test." The weight of this revelation settled over the crowd like a benediction. Ezra, the man they had mocked as the community's biggest fool, had actually been chosen by a dying scientist as the guardian of one of the world's most valuable and important animals. Bishop Hershberger, who had remained silent throughout the scientific explanations, finally stepped forward. "Dr. Martinez, what does this mean for our community? What are the obligations that come with caring for such an animal?" "That's the most beautiful part of Dr. Fisher's plan," Winters answered. According to her letter, she specifically wanted Goliath's abilities to benefit small farming communities. His enzyme can be extracted from his saliva and blood without harming him, and it can be used to create a treatment for BSE that would be freely available to any farmer who needs it. "Freely available?" Samuel Byler asked, incredulously. Dr. Martinez nodded. Dr. Fisher arranged the legal paperwork before her death. "Any treatments derived from Goliath's genetic material must be provided at cost to farming communities, with no corporate profits allowed. She essentially made sure that the cure for BSE would belong to the farmers, not to pharmaceutical companies. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the sound of someone crying. Looking around, Ezra realized it was his own wife, tears streaming down her face as she looked at him with a mixture of pride and wonder. "You knew," she whispered. "Somehow you knew he was special." "I felt something," Ezra admitted, his own voice thick with emotion. "I couldn't explain it, but I knew he didn't belong in that place, being laughed at and dismissed. He deserved better." Tom Harrison stepped forward and extended his hand to Ezra. "I owe you an apology, friend. We all do." One by one, the neighbors who had mocked Ezra's purchase approached to shake his hand or offer quiet words of respect. Even Jonas Yoder, who had been the most vocal critic, approached with tears in his eyes. "Ezra, I was wrong," he said simply. "I let pride and conventional thinking blind me to something extraordinary. Can you forgive me?" As the crowd began to disperse, each person processing the extraordinary revelations of the day, Dr. Martinez approached Ezra with one final piece of information. "Miss Stoltzfus, there's something else you should know. Dr. Fisher's letter contains specific instructions about Goliath's care. She wrote that he should be treated not as property, but as a partner. She believed that his healing abilities were strongest when he was happy and well cared for." Ezra looked across the pasture at Goliath, who stood peacefully in the afternoon sun, his magnificent head raised toward the sky. The bull seemed to sense his gaze and turned, fixing Ezra with those intelligent dark eyes that had first captured his attention at the auction. "Martinez," Ezra said quietly, "what happens now? Do we start producing this treatment immediately?" "The USDA will work with you to establish protocols for extracting and processing the enzyme," Dr. Kowalski explained. "But the beautiful thing about Dr. Fisher's plan is that Goliath can live a normal life while helping save cattle across the country. A few blood draws and saliva samples each month, and he can potentially save thousands of animals." As the officials packed up their equipment and prepared to leave, Rebecca approached her husband with a question that had been weighing on her mind. "Ezra, do you think Dr. Fisher somehow knew you would be at that auction? That you would be the one to see past Goliath's condition?" Ezra considered the question, thinking about the strange series of events that had led him to Miller's auction on that particular day, despite having no specific intention to buy livestock. "I think," he said slowly, "that sometimes God works through people in ways we can't understand." Fisher followed her conscience. "I followed my heart, and somehow those paths crossed at exactly the right moment." As the sun began to set over Millbrook, casting long golden shadows across the farmyard, Ezra found himself marveling at the day's revelations. In the span of a few hours, he had gone from being the community's laughingstock to being the guardian of a miracle. But more than that, he had learned something profound about faith, compassion, and the courage to act on conviction even when the world thinks you're wrong. Tomorrow, the real work would begin, establishing the protocols for extracting Goliath's healing enzyme and ensuring that Dr. Fisher's vision of freely available BSE treatment became reality. Tonight, however, was for reflection, gratitude, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that sometimes the most important decisions we make are the ones that seem the most foolish at the time. As the family gathered for evening prayers, young Mary asked the question that was on everyone's mind. "Dad, do you think Dr. Fisher is watching us from heaven, happy that her plan worked?" Ezra looked out at Goliath, standing peacefully in the twilight, and smiled. "I believe she is, little one. I believe she is." 6 months after the revelation of Goliath's true nature, the Stoltzfus farm had become the unlikely center of a quiet revolution in cattle care. The BSE treatment derived from Goliath's enzyme had already saved over 300 animals across Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana, with farmers making pilgrimages to Millbrook just to shake Ezra's hand and express their gratitude. But it was on a warm April morning as spring painted the Pennsylvania countryside in shades of green and gold, that Goliath would provide his greatest gift and break the heart of every person who had come to love him. The first sign that something was different came when Mary, now 13 and more devoted to Goliath than ever, found the massive bull lying peacefully in his favorite spot beneath the old oak tree that shaded the far corner of his pasture. This wasn't unusual. Goliath often rested there during the warmest part of the day. What was unusual was that he didn't raise his head when she approached, as he always did. "Goliath," Mary called softly, climbing through the fence rails with the easy grace of a girl who had spent countless hours with the gentle giant. "Are you feeling all right, old friend?" The bull's eyes opened at the sound of her voice, and Mary felt a momentary relief. But as she knelt beside his massive head, something in those dark, intelligent eyes made her catch her breath. There was a depth there, a profound sadness mixed with what could only be described as completion. Mary called out, her voice carrying across the farmyard with the urgency that only a child who has spent her life around animals can possess. "Mom, come quick! Something's wrong with Goliath!" Rebecca emerged from the kitchen at a run, her flour-covered apron trailing behind her. She was followed moments later by Ezra, who had been mending fence in the north pasture and had heard his daughter's call. What they found beneath the oak tree would remain etched in their memories forever. Goliath lay on his side, his breathing slow but steady, his massive frame somehow diminished despite his unchanged size. But it wasn't his physical condition that struck them most profoundly. It was the expression in his eyes. There was a peacefulness there, a serene acceptance that spoke of a creature who had completed his life's work. "Go get Dr. Winters," Ezra instructed Jacob, who had appeared at his father's side. "Tell her it's urgent." He paused, studying Goliath's face. "Tell her to come prepared for anything." As Jacob raced toward the house to call the veterinarian, Sarah and Mary positioned themselves on either side of Goliath's great head, their small hands stroking his neck with the gentle touch that had characterized their relationship with him from the beginning. "He's not in pain, Dat," Sarah observed with the wisdom that comes from deep connection to animals. "But something's changed." Dr. Winters arrived within an hour, bringing with her not only her medical equipment, but also Dr. Martinez, who had become something of a regular visitor to the farm as they worked together to perfect the BSE treatment protocols. The examination was thorough, but gentle, with Goliath submitting to every procedure with his characteristic patience. When Dr. Winters finally straightened up, her expression was a mixture of professional concern and something deeper, a recognition that transcended medical diagnosis. "His vital signs are stable," she announced, "but there are changes at the cellular level that I've never seen before. It's as if his body is preparing itself for—" She trailed off, unable to complete the thought. "For what?" Rebecca asked, though her voice suggested she already knew the answer. Dr. Martinez, who had been consulting her tablet and comparing readings with previous tests, looked up with tears in her eyes. "For transformation, Goliath's enzyme production has increased dramatically over the past month, far beyond what we've ever recorded. His body has been working overtime to produce as much of the healing compound as possible." "But why?" Mary asked, her young voice breaking slightly. "Why would he do that?" It was Tom Harrison who provided the answer. He had arrived while Dr. Winters was conducting her examination, bringing news that would provide the final piece of the puzzle. "I've been making calls all morning," Tom announced, his weathered face grim. "There's been an outbreak of a new strain of BSE in Europe, something more aggressive than what we dealt with here. The regular treatment isn't working, and it's spreading fast." Dr. Martinez looked up from her tablet with sudden understanding. "That's why his enzyme production has increased. Somehow his body is anticipating the need for a more potent treatment." "But how could he possibly know about an outbreak in Europe?" Sarah asked. Dr. Winters shook her head in wonder. "We're dealing with something beyond normal biological processes here. Goliath has always seemed to sense disease before it became apparent to us. Maybe his awareness extends further than we ever imagined. As the day progressed, more visitors arrived at the farm. Word had spread through Millbrook that something was happening with Goliath, and families began gathering to pay their respects to the bull, who had become a symbol of hope and redemption for their community. Bishop Hersberger arrived in the late afternoon, bringing with him several of the community's elders. Even Jonas Yoder came, his earlier mockery long since replaced by genuine respect and affection for the remarkable animal. But it was as the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, that Goliath made his final gift known. Dr. Martinez had been monitoring the bull's enzyme levels throughout the day, and what she discovered defied all medical understanding. In the past 12 hours, Goliath had produced more of the healing compound than he had in the previous 6 months combined. "It's as if he's giving us everything he has left," she whispered, her scientific composure finally breaking down completely. That evening, as the family gathered around Goliath for what they somehow knew would be their last night together, Mary made a discovery that would become the stuff of legend in Millbrook. She had been sitting beside the bull's head, reading to him from her favorite book of poems, when she noticed something extraordinary. Every time she paused between verses, Goliath would make a soft sound. Not quite a moo, not quite a sigh, but something that sounded remarkably like contentment. "He's listening," she announced to her family with wonder. "He really understands." It was then that Rebecca, moved by an impulse she couldn't explain, began to sing. Her voice, clear and sweet in the gathering darkness, carried the melody of an old Amish hymn about God's love for all his creatures. As her voice rose and fell with the ancient melody, something magical happened. One by one, the neighbors who had gathered around the pasture began to join in. Samuel Byler's deep bass, Martha's clear soprano, the children's high voices, all blending together in a harmony that seemed to embrace not just Goliath, but the entire valley. Throughout it all, Goliath lay peacefully beneath the oak tree, his eyes open and alert, as if memorizing every face, every voice, every moment of love that surrounded him. As the last notes of the hymn faded into the night air, Goliath slowly, deliberately raised his massive head. One final time, his gaze moved from person to person, as if offering a personal farewell to each individual who had touched his life. When his eyes finally came to rest on Ezra, the connection between man and beast was so profound that everyone present could feel it. In that moment, understanding passed between them, gratitude, forgiveness, and a love that transcended speech. "Thank you," Ezra whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. "Thank you for choosing us. Thank you for trusting us. Thank you for showing us what faith really means." Goliath's response was to lower his great head until it rested in Ezra's lap, a gesture of such complete trust and affection that there wasn't a dry eye in the gathering. He closed his eyes as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, and with the gentlest of sighs, Goliath passed peacefully from this world to whatever realm awaits creatures whose purpose has been perfectly fulfilled. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by quiet weeping and whispered prayers. In that moment, every person present understood that they had witnessed something far beyond the ordinary, the passing of a being who had touched their lives in ways that would echo through generations. Dr. Martinez, through her tears, managed to collect the final samples of Goliath's enhanced enzyme samples that would indeed prove capable of treating the new European strain of BSE and save countless animals across the globe. But more than the scientific legacy, more than the lives saved, more than the economic impact, Goliath's true gift was the lesson he had taught about looking beyond appearances, about having faith in the impossible, and about the power of compassion to change the world. At the funeral service 3 days later, Bishop Hersberger spoke words that would be remembered long after the last shovelful of earth had been placed over Goliath's grave beneath the oak tree. "We gather today not to mourn the passing of an animal, but to celebrate the life of a teacher. Goliath taught us that worth is not determined by price tags or popular opinion. He taught us that miracles often come disguised as foolishness. Most importantly, He taught us that sometimes the greatest act of faith is to see value where others see only worthlessness. As the community dispersed, each family carrying with them memories of the remarkable bull who had changed their lives, Ezra remained by the grave with his family. "Will we ever see another animal like him?" Mary asked, her 13-year-old heart still breaking from the loss. Ezra considered the question carefully, looking out over the pasture where Goliath had spent his brief but meaningful time with them. "Perhaps not exactly like him," he said finally, "but Goliath's real gift wasn't his special enzyme or his monetary value. His gift was teaching us to see with our hearts instead of our eyes, to trust in love instead of logic, and to have the courage to act on compassion even when the world calls us fools." He knelt down and placed his weathered hand on the fresh earth that covered his friend. "And if we can learn to see the world the way Goliath saw us, with patience, forgiveness, and unconditional love, then every creature we encounter has the potential to be miraculous." As the family walked back toward their house in the gathering twilight, Rebecca slipped her hand into her husband's. "Do you have any regrets?" she asked quietly. "About the mockery, the judgment, the difficult day?" Ezra paused and looked back one more time at the oak tree where Goliath rested, where wildflowers were already beginning to sprout around the grave. "Regrets? No," he said with absolute certainty. "How can I regret the best 25 cents I ever spent?" And in the gentle evening breeze that rustled through the oak leaves, those who listened with their hearts could swear they heard the sound of a contented bull, at peace at last, reminding them that love multiplies when it's given away, and that the most valuable things in life often come disguised as the most worthless. The village of Millbrook was never quite the same after Goliath's passing. The community had learned something precious about faith, about judgment, and about the courage to do right even when it appears foolish. And every spring, when the wildflowers bloomed around the oak tree where a very special bull lay at rest, the children of Millbrook would gather to hear the story of the man who saw past appearances, to recognize a miracle, and in doing so created an even greater miracle of his own. The story of Ezra Stoltzfus and his 25-cent bull became legend, passed down through generations as a reminder that sometimes the greatest wisdom appears as the greatest folly, and that love, patient, faithful, and unconditional, has the power to shake not just villages, but the very foundations of what we think we know about the world. In the end, that was Goliath's true legacy. Not the lives he saved or the money he was worth, but the hearts he changed and the lesson he taught about the value of seeing others, human or animal, through the eyes of love.